بنية
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
ثالثة على حب أبي عبد الله الحسين بأعلى أصواتكم تؤجرون.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Dear respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The topic for tonight's discussion, inshallah, is going to revolve around the question of the reliability of the events of Karbala. How reliable are the accounts and the reports that we have as they pertain to the events specifically of the 10th of Muharram, as well as more generally from the time and the day Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam reached Karbala, which would be a day like today's, the 2nd of the month of Muharram, when Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and his caravan reached Karbala, and even the events before and leading to Karbala, and the events following Karbala itself, when the women and the children were taken as captives all the way to Damascus. How reliable are those events? To what extent can we actually rely on the reports that tell us that so and so did this or that, or so and so said this or that? To what extent can we rely on these reports? And this is a question that is asked, generally speaking, about all sorts of events in history, but specifically about the events of Karbala. So let's start with the beginning. The events of Karbala are obviously historical events. So we have to start from history in general. Islamic history is not perfect. There are issues with Islamic history. We have instances where we have some historians who concentrated on this or that completely insignificant person, describing to us all their indecency and corrupt actions simply because they happened to be a caliph in their time. We do have that in our Islamic history. We have omissions of very important figures and personalities and events in Islamic history. That is true. But the reality, the truth is, if we compare Islamic history to the history of any other civilization today on earth, Islamic history is the most extensive and the most detailed history we have of any civilization. And this is not even close to being compared to any other civilization. And this is not a random thing that just happened. Islamic historians have documented the most minute of details happening in their lives, and all the way from the beginning of the documentation of the history in the time of the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which basically tells us that the reason why Islamic history is so extensive and the reason why it's so detailed, again, is not a random act, it's not a random occurrence. It's because the Holy Prophet instructed people to write down and document Islamic history. The details of this, inshallah, we're going to leave for the nights to come, but keep that point in mind. What this tells us, if we study the Islamic history, is that first of all, as compared to other histories, it is the most detailed and the most extensive of histories. That's one. And two, even though there might be some discrepancies and contradictions and differences of opinion between this historian and that, someone who reaches a level of expertise in history is going to be able to dig through all this documentation and all these works of history and be able to create a coherent and reliable picture of a historical event that would have taken place, or a certain historical figure that existed in the history of Islam. This is in general. Let's now turn our attention to al-maqatil. This idea of al-maqtal is actually something that started to exist in early Islamic history. If we go back to the early Islamic history, we see that there are different types of historical works. In literature, they refer to them as genre. These are different genres of literature that existed in early Islamic history. They include works of seerah, of maghazi, of futuhat, and maqatil. The way historians used to write history was by compiling and putting together the events depending on the type of event it was. If it was related to war, or if it was related to the killing or the murdering of a people or a person, if it was related to the biography of a person, then it would fall into one of these categories, and one of them was al-maqatil. Later in Islamic history, some big historians came and they started writing what today we would refer to as general history. And these became the encyclopedias of history that we have. Ibn al-Athir and al-Tabari and others, when they started writing history, they were no longer categorizing the events according to this or that type of historic event. The events were now all lumped together under the general heading of general history. But until then, and in early Islamic history, they were split depending on the type of event that they were. So in the type of event that we're discussing the events related to the killing, the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and so it falls under the general heading of maqatil. So what we would have to do is to go into the books of maqatil and to try to assess the reliability of these books as they have come down to us through history. What we want to find out is, to what extent are we going to be able to rely on these books? To what extent are we going to consider them valid historically or not? The conclusion that we're going to reach, inshallah, at the end of this, is that we're not going to say that the events and the reports that we have of the events of Karbala and the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam are perfect in every way. In fact, our scholars are always working on them. There are scholars who are experts in history and who spend a lot of time researching and studying and comparing old manuscripts to see maybe something else can be found out. Some of the issues are, for instance, that we find, and a lot of these have been cleaned or cleansed with time, we have some exaggerations in some reports. We have some differences in this name or that from time to time, or in numbers, or in dates. Those exist. Another issue that we encounter is that at times we have some people who seem to have understood poetic verses because they were very important in documenting the events, and they still are. They understood the verses of a certain poet as though they are the words of the infallible or the words of a certain personality, when in fact there was a poetic license, as they say. The poet took a little bit of liberty in order to express himself as poetically as possible, so someone who's not aware of that component may think that these words are attributable to the person as they are said, as though it's a direct quote, when in fact it's a verse of a poem. But when we look at all of these together and we put them together, we have to conclude that if those are the only issues, then these are secondary and minor details, because the events, generally speaking, that took place, the tragedy and the calamity and the big events and the big sermons and the big personalities, have all been preserved. So where there might be some discrepancies, and those are not going to be the ones we talk about, we don't have time, are maybe at times in those details. So we're not addressing those tonight. So let's turn our attention now to these books of maqatil. Over the centuries, there have been dozens upon dozens of books under the heading of maqatil that have been written. If we go back to the history of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, however, and maybe this is a point we should mention first, the difference between the maqatil of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and the other works of maqatil is crucial. Other works of maqatil, when they were written, who would consult them? You would have people who are experts in biography or ancestors and nasaba who may consult these books. You have historians who may consult these books. The difference between that and consulting the work of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, his maqtal, is that the maqtal of Imam al-Hussein has been consulted continuously, as we shall see, for over 1300 years. It has been consulted continuously all the time, continuously and regularly throughout the year, and very formally to commemorate the event of his martyrdom in the month of Muharram. And this has been taking place without a doubt, and it can be historically proven, for at least 1300 years, if not more. And inshallah we're going to talk about that in a second. In fact, today when the majority of the Muslim world and the Arab world, when they hear maqtal without any other qualifiers, their mind goes directly to the maqtal of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And the reason is because of its popularity, because of how famous it is, and how regularly it was consulted since the time that these maqatil were created. So how many maqatil are there? There are a lot of maqatil. So what we need to do is to go back to the original sources of the maqatil. My account, and we're going to put aside the minor works and the partial works. We're going to look directly at the works that are considered to be the sources of the maqatil today. By my account and my studying, there are 7 maqatil that were written between the year 100 and the year 200 of the Hijrah. If we go back to the events of Karbala, they took place in the year 61. Which basically tells us, and this is going to become extremely significant for us, the first of the people who wrote one of these maqatil that we know of, Al-Asbagh ibn Nabata, he passed away year 101. Which tells us that this is exactly 40 years after the events of Karbala. Which also tells us that his book must have been written less than 40 years after the events of Karbala. Because he passed away 40 years. So he may have written it 20 years or 30 years after the events of Karbala. Unfortunately, some of our scholars have referred to another of the maqatil, and inshallah we're going to spend a little bit of time on that one. Maqtal Abi Mikhnaf, they refer to it sometimes as being the first of the maqatil. And this is not accurate. There were at least 3 other maqatil that were written before Maqtal Abi Mikhnaf. The first is Maqtal Al-Asbagh ibn Nabata. The second one is the Maqtal of Jabir ibn Yazid al-Ju'fi. And perhaps the third one of the maqatil, and there might have been others. I have a list of 7 of them, and all of them are very well noticed and very well mentioned in the books of history. We have, for instance, Ammar ibn Muawiyah al-Duhni. We have, for instance, Al-Nasr ibn Muzahim al-Manqari, and there are others. These are very well known maqatil. These are considered the sources of all the other maqatil that were written about Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. So the first fact that we have to keep in mind about these maqatil is that their writing started 30, 20, 30, and maximum 40 years after the events of Karbala. Why is that significant? Because that tells us that those historians had access to the people who actually witnessed the events themselves. And in the worst case scenarios, they had access to people who had encountered the people who witnessed the events and documented those events. So this is something that we have to keep in mind when we look at these maqatil specifically. The second point about all of these 7, the main 7 ones, is that all of them happen to be people who were at least residents or people who spent their entire lives in the city of Kufa. And the city of Kufa at that time, we have to remember, was the metropolis, was one of the main capitals, if not the main capital of the Islamic world. So to be a well-known historian writing in that time is not equivalent to being a historian or a writer sitting somewhere else in some village elsewhere in the Islamic world. These people had access to the information. You had the greatest scholars in that city. So when we say all of these people had to do with the city of Kufa, it is significant. And it's also significant from another point of view, which is, if you go back through their lives, the majority of them were considered to be followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt. This is not equivalent to saying that they were Shia in the sense that we understand today. Okay, and this is an important distinction, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. It's one thing to say that there are people who loved Ahlul Bayt, and there are people who recognized their right and the validity of their political and religious positions. That's one thing. But that's different than saying that those people adhered to the theology and the ideological positions of a typical Shi'i as we have today, in the sense of saying, for instance, that an imam is divinely appointed or that he is infallible. Those people were not necessarily falling in that category. We can call them sympathizers, people who recognize the right of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam without necessarily being the Shia. And this is an important point, and we'll come back to it in a second. So from among all of these books of Maqatil, the most important of these books, the most famous of these books, is Maqtal Abi Makhnaf. That book has become the most famous, the most popular, the most quoted Maqtal of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam over the centuries. Why? The book itself is considered to be extremely meticulous, very detailed, and very extensive. And it doesn't just start, and this was the style of Abi Makhnaf, he would not just start with the event. He would start way before to explain to you the causes and the factors that led to certain events. So we need to understand the man a little bit more. Who was Abi Makhnaf? His ancestor was one of the companions of the Holy Prophet. His grandfather was considered one of the Shia and the followers of Imam Ali alayhi salam. What we know for sure, we don't know all the details, but what we know for sure is that at some point when Imam Ali alayhi salam needed support in the Battle of Siffin, he wrote a letter to his grandfather and asked him to support him, and he came and he supported Imam Ali alayhi salam in the Battle of Siffin against Muawiyah. That much we know. We don't know that much about his father. There are some details here and there, but they're iffy and not entirely accurate, perhaps. So what about the man himself? Abi Makhnaf was considered and was called in his own time, they refer to him as Shaykh al-Mu'arrikhin in Kufa. He was the chief historian, the greatest historian in the city of Kufa, about which we just mentioned a few words. In other words, he was one of the greatest historians in the Islamic world in his time. That's the first thing about this man. A second thing is that everybody who knows about him and who has known about him since then is unanimous about the reliability of what he delivers and what he reports and what he recounts. All the Muslims, Sunni and Shia, accept without much questioning anything that Abi Makhnaf reports, especially in history. There is a little bit of discrepancy about the other reports that we have from him. He wrote a large number of books. Unfortunately, none of them have survived. He specialized as a historian, he specialized in the land of Iraq, the entire land of Iraq, since the demise of the Holy Prophet until his own time. He passed away year 157 of Hijrah. And he most likely was born about the year 42 to 45 of Hijrah. So he would have been about 10 to 15 years old during the events of Karbala. This man was considered extremely meticulous and dedicated to his craft. So people, generally speaking, relied on anything that he reported. But because he was so outspoken and he was so open in narrating what he found out, so he would go and dig and ask and interview and find the truth and write it in his books. And this was a very dangerous thing to do. because he was often talking about the injustices that were being made against Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam al-Hassan alayhi salam, Imam al-Hussein, he was very cheaply and easily labeled as just simply being a Shi'i. Was he truly a Shi'i? It's extremely questionable. The majority of the scholars never really considered him a Shi'i. Abi Mukhnaf was not a Shi'i. He was simply objective in the manner in which he retold history as he found it. And we have some big scholars like Ibn Abi al-Hadid al-Mu'tazili, for instance, clearly says, he goes through his history and he tells us he was not a Shi'i. We have a Shaykh al-Mufid clearly telling us he was not a Shi'i. And we know there are indications from his own life. Abi Mukhnaf basically was the contemporary of 4 Imams. Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, and Imam Musa al-Kadhim. He lived with 4 Imams. He had access to all of them. And yet, nothing in whatever has reached us from what he has ever written or reported by anyone else gives any indication that those Imams existed in his time. He does not report a single saying of one of these Imams. He doesn't talk about them in his books, which is something that would be considered very strange if he were truly a Shia in the sense that we understand today. So his crime or his problem, the reason why he was often labeled as a Shia and they want to dismiss him or what he says because of that, is simply because he was transparent and open and objective in the manner in which he reported history as he found it. So how did this man work? Did he just sit in his house and write away anything and everything that he knew by heart? No. And this is not how, generally speaking, those historians worked. What they would do is that they would track down people who had experienced firsthand an event. And they would spend time with them. They would interview them, do proper journalistic work, and they would document everything that they would find out. So this may mean that sometimes you find someone and they contradict what someone else has said. They document it. And then it becomes easy afterwards to read both accounts, and you can tell why maybe one of them would have distorted the event. And by putting them all together, you have a much more reliable and accurate picture of the events and how they happened. So if we go to Abi Mukhnaf and the people, some of the people that he actually interviewed and the people that he encountered in his time, we know, for instance, that he ran into, and these are people, as we said, that he tracked down. One of the people that he tracked down was Uqba ibn Sam'an. Uqba ibn Sam'an was the servant of Al-Rabab, the wife of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and he had accompanied Imam al-Hussein throughout his entire journey all the way to Karbala. In Karbala, he was not a warrior, he did not fight. After the events of Karbala, he was imprisoned and captured and taken, and then when he told them that I'm simply a servant, I have nothing to do with anything and I haven't fought, they released him. So this man, Uqba, he spent the rest of his life recounting the events as they transpired through the journey of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam all the way to Karbala and the events that happened afterwards. That's one of the men. And then Abi Mukhnaf tried to track down the commanders and the people who were considered to be very famous and important figures in the army of Umar ibn Sa'd. Some of the people that he tracked down were Zuhair ibn Abdul Rahman, or Thabit, son of Umayr, or Yahya, who was the son of Hani, which is quite strange. Hani ibn Urwa was a lover and a companion of Imam al-Hussein and Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam. He was fighting alongside Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and his son was fighting against the camp of Imam al-Hussein with Umar ibn Sa'd. So Abi Mukhnaf actually tracked this man, Yahya ibn Hani. He tracked him down and he would ask him, what were the events that took place? You were in the army. You went through the daily routine and the regular activities of the events all the way to the 10th of Muharram. What happened? Tell me. And he would write down everything that happened as it happened in his maktab. So what's the issue? If we have someone as reliable as Abi Mukhnaf, and he is so detailed and extensive in the way that he writes, then what's the issue? The issue is that the work of Abi Mukhnaf, Maqtal Abi Mukhnaf, did not survive. As a complete work today, it does not exist. In fact, none of his works exist, including the Maqtal. So why is it important and why are we talking about it? Because every other historian that has come since has mainly relied on the Maqtal of Abi Mikhnaf, and in certain cases alongside other Maqatil, to retell and recount the story of the events of the tragedy of Karbala. And this is what we find from the Maqtal of Shaykh al-Mufid to everything we find which is in the year 400 of the Hijrah, to Al-Tabari, for instance, in the year 300. We find that they continued to use, Al-Tabari in fact uses Abi Mikhnaf almost word for word, copy-pasted from beginning to end. If you want to read something very close to what Abi Mikhnaf had in his Maqtal, you read the chapters around the Maqtal in Tabari, and you see that it's all a repetition of what Abi Mikhnaf recounted. And this continued to be the case until 6 or 7 centuries later by other historians, Abil Fida and others continued to do the same. And this idea of maqatil and the evolution and the work that has been done on the maqatil of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, and specifically Maqtal Imam al-Hussein, has continued throughout this time until nowadays. We continue until today to have scholars who spend a lot of time and a lot of effort researching and investigating the events of Karbala from the beginning to the end and writing their own version, their own conclusions of their research about this event. And allow me to mention one in case one of you guys want to refer back to it. And I mention this one because it's considered an incredibly important work today. In fact, the author became very famous because he wrote this work, just like Abi Mikhnaf. He eternalized his name simply by associating with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and repeating the events of Karbala. We have one of our scholars, very big scholar. He's a legal scholar, a faqih. He's a poet. He's a historian. He wrote many works. And yet, when anyone wants to talk about one of his works, or they say his name, only one of his works comes to mind, which is Maqtal Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And the reason I mention it is because it's a easily accessible translation in English that anyone can consult if you wish to, of Sayid Abdul Razzaq al-Muqarram, Maqtal of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. This work is ongoing from our scholars when it comes to the research done about the Maqatil. The 2 points that we want to mention, that we want to end with here, have to do with an important question before we move to the other sources for the reliability of the events of Ashura. If the events of Ashura happened year 61 after the Hijrah, and what we're saying is that the first maqatil that started to be written happened only perhaps 20 or 30 or almost 40 years later, then we need to ask the question, why? Why were the maqatil not written right away to document the events right away after the event as the event happened? And as we shall see, we are not saying that the event was not documented. The event was documented. The issue is that there were no formal maqatil written to document the event and publicly available, openly available in society. And there are 2 reasons for this that we do not have time to detail right now. Keep them in mind, we're going to come back to them over the next few nights. The first reason why the maqtal was not documented into a maqtal right away is because, and this may come as a surprise to a lot of people, is that there was a prohibition against writing in the Islamic world. No one was allowed to just start writing anything. The government of the time has to give you an explicit permission to write before you can write. Otherwise, no one is allowed to write anything in the Islamic world at that time. We're going to come back to that over the next few nights. And the second reason is that everybody knew that anyone who does or says anything that gives the impression that they are a sympathizer or a follower of Imam Ali alayhi salam or his school, they were going to suffer a persecution. They're going to lose their rights. They might be punished and tortured and killed simply because someone may say they are a Shia. And it could be as simple as the name you carry. And inshallah we'll come back to that as well. But these are 2 main reasons why we see the events of Karbala not being formalized and documented into proper books of history, as at that time would have been called maqatil. So are the books of maqatil the only source of information? This would be reliable enough. As we're saying, these maqatil have been read for over 13 centuries now in a continuous manner. But are they the only available sources for the events, the details of the events that actually transpired in the land of Karbala? No. There are in fact many other sources. So we want to go through them very quickly. The first one is the accursed Yazid himself. Yazid is the type of oppressor and tyrant who wants to be able to brag about the manner in which he was able to defeat Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. How he was able to crush his enemy in detail. He wants to be able to do that in front of his audience and those who follow him and those who are close to him. So he did two things, Yazid. The first is that, more objectively, he doesn't want to rely on the people who are in the army to tell him what's happening. They might not be objective because they want rewards for what's happening. So he actually paid people to go and observe the events, sit on the sideline and not participate, simply document everything as it was happening and come back and tell Yazid everything that had happened. That's one category of people. And the other category is that he actually gave rewards. He paid handsomely. If you were going to go to Yazid and tell him some details that no one else has told him about, and the manner in which he was able to crush and defeat Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. One of those people that most likely fits into the first category is a very famous name that anyone who listens to the maqatil and the musibah, we always hear that name, Hamid ibn Muslim. Who was Hamid ibn Muslim? He was simply a man that seems to have been paid by Yazid to document the event, so that Yazid doesn't rely on anyone else to know what was going on. He was supposed to be neutral, objective. You sit on the sideline, you take note of everything that's happening, documented in the proper sequence, and you come back and you tell me what happened. And I will pay you handsomely for that. And history tells us that's exactly what happened. Hamid ibn Muslim actually went back to Yazid and did tell him and recount everything that happened, and he was paid handsomely. We're also told that that man actually became unstable mentally afterwards because of everything that he had witnessed in Karbala. And there are people who tell us that he became unable to sleep at night after the events of Karbala, and that he joined the revolution or the uprising of those who wanted to repent out of regret for not having followed Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, at-Tawabun. He joined that movement afterwards. But still, when people look at the events as he was narrating them, it's very difficult to read all those events and to imagine that man sitting in that situation and seeing everything, all the injustice and all the tragedies and calamities befalling Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and his companion and his family members, and not be moved by them. And yet this man just sat there coldly, documenting the facts and not doing anything to support or give a hand to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. He says, however, there is one incident and one event where he feels that he was broken by that event. He tells us after the beheading and after the murder of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, when they set fire to the tents, he says the woman started running from one tent to another, and he noticed that the fire was starting to reach the dress of one of the girls, a young girl who was standing at the entrance of one of the tents. And so he says, I rushed to the girl and I gave her water and I told her, use this water to turn off this fire from your dress and to drink a little bit. And he says that girl, the young girl, did not move. She just looked at me and she said, are you with us or against us? And this is where we know that he was more of a journalist than a historian. And he told her, I'm neither with you nor against you. And she told him, how dare you give me water when my father was just killed without drinking any water? These events, when we say that they're reliable, it's because we have people who were able to repeat them to us In his own words, Hamid ibn Muslim is telling us that that event actually broke him. He's also the one, because there are some, if you follow people on YouTube, there is this tendency right now to question some of the events based on a historical foundation. They want to question the events of Ashura. In one case, they're mocking the fact that we say that there were over 300 injuries and wounds on the body of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And so they say, who in their right mind would actually sit and count 300 wounds on that kind of body? If you understand the role of someone like Hamid ibn Muslim, then you understand that he actually was paid to do that. That was his role. And that's why he sat beside everybody and counted the injuries and what types of injuries, and he went back to Yazid and told him. So it's not as cheaply dismissed or easily dismissed to say these are fabrications by the Shia to exaggerate the calamity of Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam. Hamid ibn Muslim is the one who first described the body of Imam al-Hussein at the moment right after he was beheaded. He says that his body looked like the body of a porcupine or the body of a hedgehog. Okay, these events or these details in the events, they don't come to us later in history. They were there right from the beginning. A second source that we have that tells us about the reliability of the events of Karbala after the Maqatil and after the people that were working for Yazid himself, we have the people who were injured but not killed in the event. This would require another lengthy discussion that we don't have time for right now, but we are told that Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, each one of the members of Ahl al-Bayt, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, Imam al-Hussein, Jafar al-Tayyar, they all had a number of people, their sons, all attending the events of Karbala on the 10th of Muharram. Imam al-Hasan had 7 sons with Imam al-Hussein on the 10th of Muharram. 6 of them were killed. The 7th of the sons of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam was injured but not killed. His name was al-Hasan al-Muthanna. And he was in such a state at that time that they came to kill him, but they saw that his injuries were so significant that they decided to just let him live. They said he's either going to die from his wounds and his injuries, or if he lives, he won't be able to represent any harm for us. So they just let him live. And history tells us that he's the one who went back and later married the daughter of Imam Hussein alayhi salam that he had left behind, Fatima al-Sughra. He married her and they had descendants. And this is a descendants of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam later on. This man would actually tell us, he was with Imam al-Hussein right from the beginning and all the way to the end. The only difference is that he survived the events and he was able to tell others about them. And this is, people would seek out these people and they would come to them and they would ask them about the reliability of the events because they knew that they were there. The uprising of Al-Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, a huge source of the information and the details of the information that we have comes from the uprising of this man. Al-Mukhtar bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi was in jail when this revolution or this movement of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam took place. He was told about it later on. So when he came, he vowed that he was going to track down the people who led the attacks and who led the armies against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and he wanted to punish them in a way that he thought was befitting for the way they need to be punished for what they had done. So he started trying to track people like Umar ibn Sa'd and Ibn Ziyad and many others, including Harmala ibn Kahil. And I don't have the heart to go through the details. So I'll simply say, when he asked Harmala, what did you do? And this is how, these are examples of where we get the details when we say this is the events of Karbala and they are reliable. He would ask each and every one of them, what did you do and how did you feel when you did it? And so Harmala says, I threw 3 arrows. One of them landed in the eye of Abu Fadl al-Abbas after his arms had been cut. And one of them I aimed for the neck of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, but instead it landed on the son of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, who came rushing to protect his uncle and who died in the lap of the Imam. And the third one is the one that killed Abdullah al-Radi' in the hands of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam when he asked for some water for him. When we say that we have the details and that they are reliable, we can trace them back to these types of events and these types of tracking down. We have also some people that were in attendance with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, but who were not warriors. These were the women and some of the children that happened to be with Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam at that time. Obviously, these people did not fight with the Imam, but they were taken as captives afterwards. So they went through the entire journey, they came back to Medina, and they spent, in the majority of cases, the rest of their lives retelling the story and the events of Karbala. We have, for instance, the wife of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, Daylam. She tells us one of the stories, and these are often repeated in the Masa'ib. We have to know where they come from. She says on the 10th or the 11th at night, after the men had been killed, and we were only women left in the camp, and all you can hear are some children crying. And she mentions in that narration, she says, and Sayyidah Zainab was not in the tents anymore. She said, I remembered my husband, Zuhair, and how his body was just thrown near the river. So she says, I took a piece of fabric and I gave it to my servant, and I told her, go find the body of Zuhair and put this piece of cloth or fabric on his body. And after a while, the servant came back, and she told her, did you find his body? She said, yes. Did you cover him with a piece of cloth? She said, no. She told her, why? She said, because I did not have the heart to cover his body, the body of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, when I saw the body of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam without any cover. These are other sources for the calamities and the tragedies of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. Then we have the poetry. We know that all the Imams would hire poets. They would bring them into their homes, they would gather the Shia, and they would gather their own families, and they would create what today we call a majlis. The gatherings to remember Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and specifically Imam al-Hussein. And they would pay those poets handsomely, and they would give them praise, and they would give them gifts. And we have this all the way from Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, to Imam al-Baqir, to Imam al-Sadiq, to Imam al-Kadhim, to Imam al-Rida alayhi salam, and the very famous encounters he had with one of the most famous poets of his time and until now, Di'bil al-Khuza'i, who had prepared this epic poem that he wanted to recite for Imam al-Rida alayhi salam. And in this, he's documenting the tragedies of Ahlul Bayt, specifically the ones of Ashura. And we are told in history that when he would recite the verses, and he's talking about very specific things in the verses, this is not all metaphors. We are told that when he's describing things that are accurate, Imam al-Rida alayhi salam would sit and cry. And when he would narrate or recount or say something in his poetry that was not accurate, the Imam would actually correct him. And sometimes he would even give him the right words, the right wording, how to say it so that it becomes right. And we are told that the famous poem that he has, which starts with the verses أفاطم لو خلت الحسين مجدلا وقد مات عطشانا بشط فراتي إذا للطمت الخد فاطم عنده. He says, O Fatima, if only you could attend the lying body of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam as he was dead, thirsty, right beside the river of Euphrates, then you would do a latma of your own cheek, Fatima. And the narrations tell us that every time the poet would reach these words, these verses, the people would come to Di'bil and they would tell him, stop. And he would say, why? They tell him, because Imam al-Rida alayhi salam fainted. And this happened 3 times until the Imam was able to continue on with the rest, and then he corrected the rest of the poem. And after all of this, and the last source that we have for the calamities that happened in the tragedies of Karbala are the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. The majority of the Imams left us fragments and narrations and pieces that tell us in detail or an overview what happened and what transpired in the events of Karbala. All of them have something to say about it. If you want to read the words of your own Imam, the Imam of our time, Ajalallah Ta'ala Farajah, as we mentioned yesterday, go back to the famous Ziyarat al-Nahiya al-Muqaddasa, and then you will see how your own Imam describes many of the events of Karbala in detail. Imam al-Mahdi Ajjalallah Farajah talks to his grandfather Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, and he tells him, he repeats, and you can see the events as they're happening when you read the words. They're very graphic. He tells him, and I can still see how the hooves of the horses came trampling your body again and again. These details, they are not fabrications. We have not made them up simply to create a tragic story. They actually happened in this manner. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, one of the sources, and I don't want to run out of time, one of the sources of these events is Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. He was alive, he was in the events of Karbala. He was 3 years old. But there is no doubt that the greatest source for the reliability of the events of Karbala is none other than Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam. He survived those events from the beginning to the end. And then he spent the next 30 some years of his life repeating those events in every opportunity he had, so that people would realize the calamity, the tragedy, the injustices that had been made and done against Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and Ahl al-Bayt in general. And there are too many to mention. I'll simply say that every time he would walk by a butcher and he would see them slaughtering a sheep, he would say, "Have you given them any water before you slaughter them?" And the butcher would say, "Of course, son of the Messenger of Allah. Who would slaughter a sheep without giving them water?" And the Imam would reply, "But my father was killed and beheaded without being given any water." We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us understand the school that is Muharram, to understand it accurately and reliably, and then to be able to guide others to it. As the Holy Prophet says, Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam is a lantern of guidance and a ship of rescue. Assalamu ala al-Hussein wa ala Ali ibn al-Hussein wa ala awlad al-Hussein wa ala ashab al-Hussein wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.